Good morning, and thanks again for joining us for another episode of the SCSA's weekly Toolbox Tuesday. Today, we're going to be talking about the first aid regulations in Saskatchewan, specifically about some of the upcoming changes to those regulations and how they can be applied in your workplace. In April of this year, the occupational health and safety regulations will change to reflect 2020 as the most recent modernization of those regulations. Most of the specific regulations in there have not actually changed, but some of them have, including the first aid regulations. So before we get into that, as always, these Toolbox Talks are recorded and will be available on our website and on our social media channels afterwards. So feel free to go on there and find this afterwards, share it with anybody you'd like, as well as follow us on those social media channels to get all of our most updated information and our recent Toolbox. Okay, so the first aid regulations. So the requirements and changes to the first aid regulations are meant to bring Saskatchewan in alignment with the CSA standards on first aid in the workplace. Specifically, CSA standard Z1220-17, which will not be on the test later. CSA Z1220-17 goes over first aid kits in the workplace and goes into quite a bit of detail on what's required and how to meet those requirements. So most people are familiar with the CSA group, the Canadian Standards Association, even if just to know that their work boots have that green triangle with the CSA logo inside of it. So this organization, they're composed of representatives from industry, from government, and from consumer groups. And the purpose is to get together and come up with a nationally accepted standard for different areas. So again, aligning with the standard assures that Saskatchewan is meeting a nationally agreed upon standard for first aid. So in the CSA standard, there are a few steps in developing your first aid program. And the first one is in completing a risk assessment of your workplace. The things you want to be looking for are to identify, first of all, the hazards. So how could somebody get hurt in your workplace? You know, anywhere from a small paper cut to a cut from a tool, such as like an alpha knife or a box cutter, sheet metal, all the way up to a fall or becoming trapped in a confined space even. We want to identify all the ways that somebody could get hurt on site, just so that we are prepared that if it were to happen, we can respond to it immediately and with what it needs. Once you've identified the hazards that you could face in the workplace, you need to assess those hazards and injuries for the what's called frequency and severity. Frequency is just as it sounds, how often does this happen, right? So your lower risk stuff, say handling an alpha knife, small cuts on your hands, those are generally minor, might happen more often, versus your less frequency but higher severity incidents. So things like somebody falling doesn't happen very often, but if they were to fall, there's a very high chance that the severity of those injuries would be great. So once we've identified the hazards, looking at each one of those and say, okay, how often does it happen and how bad could it be if it does happen? Once you've done that, identifying the appropriate supplies and equipment that you need in order to respond to all of those different scenarios and make sure that you have the right amount of stuff. Now, when we talk about doing your risk assessment, there's a few different things you want to consider. So the first being your building structure and the characteristics of it. Are you on a one-level office building where, you know, there's no stairs up and down? Are you constructing a 6-story condominium or a 100-story skyrise or skyscraper? We want to know what the characteristics are because that's going to determine how easy it is for first aiders to get to a person that needs help, how easy it is for first responders to get in and out. All of those things matter. As well as the number of workers and visitors on your site. You don't want to just have it for your workers. If you have visitors or public coming into your work site, you have to be able to respond to them, right? At max, how many do you guys have on your work sites? As well as things like injury trends. Look at what's happened in the past in your company. How do people most commonly get injured? What do they need in order to deal with that injury? The proximity of trained first aiders. So again, how large is your site? How many first aiders do you have? How long would it take for that first aider to get to somebody who was injured if they were on the farthest point of sight from each other? Things like that. As well as your accessibility of medical aid. So beyond a first aid, so you're responding to someone who's become sick or injured, you've determined that they need medical aid. So first aid is not going to be sufficient. They need to go see a doctor. How far away is that doctor? How far away is the clinic or the hospital? We need to be able to have enough supplies and the right type of supplies in order to get that person to medical aid. As well as look at work patterns. Shift work, for example. It's not uncommon to see companies that maybe have the right amount of first aiders on site, but once you start digging, you realize there's no trained first aiders on the night shift. So taking all that into account and making sure that there's sufficient first aid responders and first aid supplies at all times and in all locations. As well as you want to look at the transportation of the ill or the injured. Again, this can come into how far away your work site is. If you're in a downtown work site, it's likely easy for you to be able to get to a hospital or request help, such as an ambulance. But if you work in a remote area, somebody's working alone, or even in a remote enough area where a service like STARS Air Ambulance wouldn't be able to respond because you're so far from a refueling facility, you need to be able to plan that out, figure out what you're going to do to respond. As well as special needs. Is there anybody with disabilities that you have to take into account, whether that be physical or cognitive? What about mobility issues? Is anybody, or is there a potential for somebody to be maybe in a wheelchair that might need assistance getting in and out? Are you working in a building where there's no elevator? So if you had to respond, if you had to get somebody out of the building, if first responders had to come in and they have to take the stairs, you have to take that into account. How are we going to safely get someone in and out? The next step you want to take is the first aid classification. So once we've identified what the hazards are, the characteristics of our sites, that's going to determine the type of first aid kit you need. So the CSA standard has 3 types of first aid kits. Okay, the first is type 1. Now, this is a personal first aid kit, and it's meant for people that are working alone. So it's the smallest type of first aid kit under the CSA standards. The specific items that need to be in this kit are included in table 1. Then you have your type 2. Now, this is your basic first aid kit. This is for your low risk environments. Oftentimes, this is the kit you're going to have in office environments or any type of really low risk work. Now, the one thing about all of these kits is they're scalable. So even though you might have identified your workplace as low risk, you have to take into account how many people are there. And how many items you might need at any given time, right? So you can have more than one of these kits on hand. And then your type 3, this is your intermediate first aid kit. Again, scalable and for high risk work environments. So CSA 1220-17 table 3 goes into detail about all the items that need to be included in that particular kit. And then the final thing with first aid regulations, as with almost anything OH&S wise, there is going to be ongoing maintenance, right? So it's not just a one and done. We bought a first aid kit last year and I'm pretty sure it's still good to go. We need to make sure that it's good to go and include that as part of our program. So most commonly we see that as inspecting the first aid kit. So the CSA standard requires that this first aid kits be inspected every 90 days at minimum. Or if the equipment needs to be, is either expiring or needs to be replenished. So at minimum though, you want to include every 90 days looking at your first aid equipment and supplies and ensuring that it's sufficient. When you look through that, you're going to look at the completeness and the usability of the first aid equipment. Every first aid kit I've ever come across always comes with an inventory list. So it tells you exactly what is in that kit. Compare that inventory list to what's in the kit. You don't want to go to a kit and need a bandage, need some ointment, need a triangle bandage, whatever it might need. You don't want to go there and find that it's not there because nobody's looked at it. People have been using it, not documenting it. So is it complete? And are all the items usable? Is everything still not expired. Most commonly, we see items like wipes, eye wash, ointments. Those are all items that expire, right? They dry out, they become less effective. We need to check all those expiry dates and ensure everything is up to date. And then again, so we're replenishing as they were used or at minimum by the expiration date. So, and then finally, there are some requirements around the first aid container. So this is the actual container of all the first aid supplies. So the CSA standard has a few requirements. First, that it must be sufficient in size for all the materials. So you want to have everything in one kit. You don't want to have bits and pieces all over the place, and you certainly don't want to have it so full and packed that when you open it, it's like a firework, it bursts open and you get to pick up the pieces while you're trying to help somebody that may be hurt. It must be capable of being securely closed. So again, we don't want to have it so stuffed that you can't close it. If you're unable to close it, what likely will happen is that those items could get dusty, dirty, moist, and get ruined. As well, that kit needs to be portable. Right, often when someone needs first aid, especially if it's a severe injury, they can't go to the first aid kit. That first aid kit needs to come to them. So it needs to be portable and accessible. It must be protected from dust and moisture. So again, it kind of goes back to that capable of being closed, right? We want to make sure that we can close it, that it's clean, that it's not going to get dirty. So we don't have it in an open bag or in a fabric bag that's permeable to those types of things. And it must have a durable and legible first aid statement or symbol on the outside of it. We want to make it super obvious that this is the first aid kit. This is where you can get all the material you need in order to respond to a first aid. So in summary, the first aid requirements are changing slightly to meet the CSA standards, and those changes will come into effect in April of this year. As always, our dedicated and skilled safety advisors are here to help. So whether it's understanding the new legislation requirements, understanding the new CSA standards that those refer to, helping you build your first aid and emergency response plan, or any other OH&S related issues, the SCSA is here to help you. As always, you can go to scsaonline.ca to find resources on all of the information we've discussed, as well as the contact information for all of our advisors in Regina and Saskatoon. As well, on the website, you'll find a web form contact. So if you have a quick question that you just need an answer to, you can always fill that out and someone will get back to you likely within 2 business days. So again, thanks so much for joining us. We host these Toolbox Tuesdays every Tuesday. And once a month, we are hosting our Wednesday webinar. So the next one will be on March 3rd, and I'm very excited to say that it will be on our new SCSA Analytics tool. So definitely join us for that if you have time. As always, stay safe and stay healthy.